IUI, I think it's different in different settings. I mean, IUI in Sheffield for many years was our initial treatment within the NHS for unexplained or mild male factor infertility. Then the commissioners who write the rules for NHS eligibility then changed that about 5 years ago maybe, and essentially on the NHS it only became available then for anovulatory. So they really tightened up on that. And it's interesting, within the CREATE organisation there are very, very few IUI cycles. I think that's mainly driven by patients who've had some investigations done. I suppose the one group where there's still a reasonable cohort would be in the donor treatment group, so single ladies or same-sex couples. But a lot of the same-sex couples who come through, they're offered that, and they're offered tubal patency testing. But when they, you can sell it both ways. You can say, look, have several goes at insemination with donor sperm. It's a simple treatment, and it's probably going to work for you, but it's still relatively expensive per cycle. You're using sperm every cycle. Quite a lot of those ladies stroke couples, when they look at the statistics, again, and I suppose it depends how you sell the statistics, they'll often choose to go straight for IVF. Whereas I think, in the early days when I worked in Sheffield in the 90s, there was donor sperm was widely available in the UK then, before they changed the criteria. They had a hugely successful donor insemination program. And most of those ladies never got to IVF. They really didn't, because they'd have 6, 8, 10 cycles of natural cycle insemination, and no surprise, good donor sperm, they would get pregnant. And I remember in the 90s, it was very rare to see those ladies needing to come through for IVF, because the donor insemination was done on a different site. It was done within the old hospital, and we saw the patients who came through for IVF in a separate unit. We didn't see those ladies because, understandably, there was lots of donor sperm available, and they were quite happy coming back cycle after cycle, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months into it, they got pregnant. And great, much simpler treatment. So I think, again, that's been changed by things like donor sperm availability in the UK, and having to outsource donor sperm to European sperm banks, to big companies in America that make oodles of dollars out of it. And that's kind of changed the clinical practice as much as anything. But I think when people come through on the private side, there's a group of ladies who, but it's a declining proportion, I think, who still have a feeling that they would like to keep to a simpler treatment protocol. They like, maybe they've read bad things about IVF, or they've got intrinsic issues with, excessive ovarian stimulation, and they like the idea of either natural or low dose stimulation, 1 or 2 follicles, insemination, either with partner or donor. But I think, again, in the private sector, it's difficult to, I think I try to, but that's maybe because I've still got half an NHS hat on as well. I would always present that option to ladies stroke couples, because I think if there's no rush, and that's always a big part of it. So, if you've got a lady of 30, essentially with not much else going on, who needs donor sperm, why not spend some months doing simple treatment, very simple treatment? And I think that's the picture I try to sort of, I would give them the options and the pros and cons of the 2 options. And again, if they say, well, actually, that's all very well, but I just want to know what's the most likely thing to get me pregnant, to go back to what I said earlier, you can always, if you want to, sell the IVF. But I think you need to give people the opportunity to consider whether they want simpler treatment. And, again, even for ovulatory, for PCO, I think a lot of clinics, the vast majority of their PCO ladies probably go straight to IVF. Over the years, I've seen multitudes of ladies get pregnant with IUI, with PCOS. So I think that bit of the market is shrinking for perhaps non-clinical reasons sometimes. And I think that's disappointing, because, you know, it does have a place. I mean, equally in Sheffield, certainly we ended up getting more multiple pregnancies from our IUI cycles than we did from IVF in the last few years because of the high proportion of elective single embryo transfers. So, you know, that changed from, you know, the 90s when we quite often put 3 embryos back in the UK through to now where, you know, you're putting under 40, you're very rarely putting 2 embryos back, which is fine. But with IUI, obviously you're often inseminating with 2 or 3 follicles. So there is this bizarre thing where you're explaining to patients that the chance of them getting pregnant is less, but unfortunately there is statistically a not tiny chance they might end up with twins and perhaps triplets. And you know, certainly that I think the only triplets we've had in the last few years when I was at Sheffield were from IUI. I think we had one set where it was a double embryo transfer and one of the embryos divided, so it was, you know, nobody could have avoided that. But you know, 1 or 2 times a year you'd have follicles, and she'd had a few goes at IUI, and everyone would go on, she's fine, let's carry on. And you're in that situation. So, but I think it has a role. But I think it's again perhaps down to the clinics to honestly set out those options to see whether, you know, couples are interested in that. And again, if they've got to fund it themselves, you know, understanding that per cycle it's cheaper. But again, when you tie in the chance of getting pregnant, if you're having IUI, it doesn't make a great deal of sense to have one cycle. You need to look at it as a package, in which case then it's pretty well the same cost as a cycle of IVF. But at least give the people the opportunity to decide which of those options they want to start with and see how they get on with it, maybe. So yeah, I think it's certainly in the 20 years I was in Sheffield, I think the proportion of IUIs we did went down quite a lot, but some of that was directly related to changing the NHS funding criteria, because for some of those people, if they come through, if they're not eligible, they're not going to choose to have IUI, they're going to often go straight for IVF. And it even varied between the different CCGs in our locality. Not all of them made that change. So some of them change it to anovulatory only, others didn't. So you end up deciding the treatment based on the postcode of the GP that those patients have come from, which is clearly absurd, isn't it? But yeah, does that help?